I'm Walter Cronkite. This is the story of one man's battle against what he called America's lust for ugliness. He was the man who said, "Early in my life, I had to choose between honest arrogance and hypocritical humility." His name was Frank Lloyd Wright, the master architect who helped change the face of America.
Yeah, I've been accused of saying I was the greatest architect in the world, and if I had said so, I don't think it would be very arrogant, because I don't believe there are many, if any. 100 years, what we call architecture has been phony, in the sense that it was not innate, it wasn't organic, it didn't have the character of nature. So the building should be natural, appropriate to the time, appropriate to the place, and in all its features belonging to time and place and man.
This is our story, Frank Lloyd Wright.
What is the natural thing? What is the nature of your materials? Even the nature of your client? The nature of the situation on which the house is built? Nature of the climate? It's all a nature study, the building of a house.
I put a capital N on nature and call it my church, said Frank Lloyd Wright. Here on the rolling Wisconsin farmland, Frank Lloyd Wright was born. He was buried here almost a century later. From the hills of Wisconsin had sprung the idea of an organic architecture, an architecture that would grow from the earth as trees do. In 1887, 18-year-old Frank Lloyd Wright runs off to Chicago, soon joins the staff of architect Louis Sullivan. Form follows function, Sullivan teaches. His buildings represent a new American architecture, and Wright soon becomes his top draftsman, works with him for 6 years. Then in 1893, the Columbian Exposition inspires a classical revival which sweeps aside the new movement. It is the era of imitation and Victorian gingerbread. Says Wright, a house must be dedicated to the dignity of man. The Winslow House, his first independent commission, leads at the turn of the century to the unveiling of his prairie houses, designed horizontally to hug the ground. It's a revolution in interior space, one room flowing into another, the open plan. The Willets House anticipates the first carport. The Roby House, a generation ahead of its time. For some, the Prairie House is a misunderstood object of derision, but culminating in the Coonley House in 1908, it heralds for others the emergence of a genius in architecture. The Larkin Building is hailed abroad for its use of space and light. Says one critic, it has no equal in Europe. Unity Temple pioneers poured concrete as an exterior surface, but, says Wright, the reality of the building is the space within. In 1909, Wright leaves his family, runs off with the wife of a client, and in Wisconsin builds himself a refuge from notoriety, Taliesin, Shining Brow. Then in 1916, Tokyo's Imperial Hotel is begun, its foundations floated in mud to withstand earthquakes. After a major one in 1923, Wright gets the message, hotel stands undamaged as monument of your genius. But at home he gets little credit from his peers, and lurid publicity leads to few commissions. Architect Henry Klum, who came from Germany to work with Wright, tells about this time.
After the Imperial Hotel was built, Wright was practically inactive for 7 years, except for a few sporadic jobs which were done here and there, mainly in California. When he was 60 years old, we gathered, discussed his work, and all of a sudden, we were sitting around, 5 of us. All of a sudden, he straightened up. He was always straight to begin with, but he straightened up with a wonderful vision in his eyes and said, "Boys, give me 10 more years, and what could I do?"
Wright will get 30 more years. In 1932, his fortunes at low ebb, he starts the Taliesin Fellowship with his third wife, Olgivanna, at his side. From all over the world, apprentices come to Wisconsin to absorb the principles of organic architecture by actual doing in a cooperative society, dedicated to the unity of life and work, inspired by Wright's eloquence.
What is fundamental to the architect at heart? He has to know life. And he has to know life by studying it. And how do you proceed to study life most successfully and directly? By living it, don't you? And that's what we're all trying to do here. To live the life that goes with being an architect at heart, which means the study primarily, as I will tell you again and again and again, of nature. The nature of whatever is, structurally.
These are the lean years, but Wright's philosophy of work, adding tired to tired, has its lighter reward, such as the display of their produce at the country fair. They learn the way of the seasons with all living things. As the Wisconsin summer wanes, ahead lies the trip to Arizona to build their winter home in the West. Over several seasons, Taliesin West, Wright's winter headquarters near Phoenix, will be constructed by the fellowship itself. In the Arizona desert, they find a new environment with new materials. Learning the state of becoming is based on change, says Wright, continual and aesthetic change.
Don't think that when you're in the drafting room, that's your golden moment, because it isn't. Your golden moment is all the time, when you're in service and when you're in action and when you're doing things. This is a kind of learning by doing. And by doing, you'll soon get into a way of being. You're all here together for a common purpose, and you're here to make that common purpose richer as a human experience for everybody by way of your own contribution to it.
Taliesin West, forever growing, changing, evolving, becomes a part of the desert. Says one critic, shaped by a master sculptor, it is one of the most colorful, most romantic groups of buildings erected since the passing of the Mayas. Says Wright, Taliesin West is a look over the rim of the world. By 1936, Frank Lloyd Wright is almost 67. For 30 years, he has stood virtually alone against the conformist trend of a whole nation. He has lived almost an entire generation as a man rejected and disregarded in his own country, considered by the general American public an exhibitionist and eccentric. To this he says, not only do I intend to be the greatest architect who has yet lived, I intend to be the greatest of all time. Then slowly at first the commissions come in. By some members of his profession, Wright has been called an impractical visionary. Now on the drawing boards at Taliesin, the battle is joined. The long period of isolation and neglect is coming to an end. The highly publicized building for the S.C. Johnson Company in Racine, Wisconsin, turns the tide. It is a demonstration of space in continuous motion. The roof floats independent of the walls on delicately tapered mushroom-shaped columns. Building inspectors doubt the pillars can support the roof, but they do. The building means rediscovery for Frank Lloyd Wright. Falling Water, the Kaufman House near Pittsburgh, becomes world famous. Built over a waterfall, it is of organic design.
Organic architecture is a natural architecture. A natural architecture. Now, what would a natural architecture be? If the thing is successful, the architect's effort, you can't imagine that house anywhere than right where it is. It's a part of its environment, and it graces its environment rather than disgraces it.
In years ahead, commissions come quickly, built in harmony with their sites. A house in the woods, a house on the prairie, a house by the sea. Wright's buildings invite nature in. Inside, materials taken directly from nature, and a poetic arrangement of free-flowing space. Not the boxes beside boxes we call rooms, says Wright. The self-avowed egotist, Wright puts on a good show, overseeing the construction of a house or telling a client who complains of a leaking roof, move your chair. The architect is a key man in a civilization, he says, to be treated with respect. Wright seems to wear success with arrogance, but beneath are the scars of battle still not fully won. In 1950, the Taliesin Choir heralds the completion of the Unitarian Church in Madison, Wisconsin. Arriving with his wife, the man who built it, the son of a preacher, is to address the congregation.
There is something that stands much higher than wisdom. And what is it? It's the highest and the finest kind of morality. And what is that? Beauty. Now, I believe a home is much more a home for being a work of art. And I think until it is a work of art, it lacks the essential characteristics of a home. I think that the teenage trouble, the teenager today, and all this clumpity clump down the back stairs of our social status is largely due to the lack of beauty in environment, the lack of the sense of it in the home, the lack of it in the church. But here, the feeling for reverence will never die. And the feeling for reverence is something elemental to beauty and to religion. Here you'll see an expression that's best shown to you, perhaps, by the hands folded this way, an expression and a feeling of prayer, subjective, not objective prayer. If you look at this building from the outside, you'll see that. I don't think I can say much more. I need to. So thank you very much.
Taliesin in Wisconsin, the vintage years.
Well, you cannot restate any of the great forms and ideas which have characterized human civilizations if you wish to be really a creative artist. You must, from your own observation, from your own sense of what is right and beautiful, good and true, make your own statement.
In the 9th decade of his life, with some of his greatest work still ahead, Frank Lloyd Wright reaps the rewards of years of struggle, surrounded by his fellowship. Some have remained by his side for many years, working with him, helping to teach the new students. In Taliesin's drafting room, Wright calls himself an exemplar, not a teacher. Don't imitate me, he tells his apprentices, just understand the principle. Wright calls himself an amateur. A profession, he says, is restricted within a mold. He is no longer free to learn, to grow.
This idea of learning something is extremely touchy. You know, so few people can learn. You realize that? I was just thinking the other day that one of the things I liked about myself most now that I've come to my majority is that I can still learn something.
To architects the world over, not all of whom approve of his work, he is Mr. Wright. Although he has never been given a U.S. government commission, Wright, now in his 80s, has more clients seeking him out, more buildings to design than ever before. I shake them out of my sleeve, he says. Wright believes the machine should be servant to the architect, not master, as, in his opinion, are the steel and glass skyscraper cities of post-war America.
We go to New York and we see these great towers standing up there all over the place, like fingers threatening the sky. The relationship was never thought of. Every man for himself, the devil for the hindmost, and they're creating a condition below that's deadly.
Man in harmony with nature is his theme. The modern city should be destroyed, decentralized. To build tall is beautiful, he says, but the building should stand alone, free to cast its shadow on the ground. In 1955, Wright builds his first skyscraper, the Price Tower in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. A combination of offices and apartments 18 stories high, it is structured like a tree, its floors and walls supported by a central trunk of poured concrete. Says Wright, it is a tree that has escaped from a crowded forest. For the forest of New York City, Wright designs the Guggenheim Museum. Its shell-like shape is an act of defiance against the rectangular city structures surrounding it. Considered by some a masterpiece of architectural sculpture, and by others as bizarre, its interior displays a continuous ramp spiraling around a vast light well. It is Wright's only building in New York. Many startling designs remain on paper, such as his mile-high, for Chicago, 528 stories. The government was never to award a commission to America's most famous of controversial architects. But in October 1958, he gives his views on a national cultural center. Robert Richmond of the Institute of Contemporary Arts asked Wright if it is architecturally possible to relate such a building to the architecture of the Lincoln Memorial.
The Lincoln Memorial is related to the toga and the civilization that wore it. And I think it would be absurd to try and maintain the weaknesses and follies of the old lack of culture. Now, the Lincoln Memorial is not an indication of culture. It's an indication of the lack of it. The old Capitol is not an indication of culture, although I'm in favor of preserving these old mistakes, these old evidences of the old life, in order that the new life may shine the brighter.
Yes.
And so forth. You know the story.
Three times that you've seen this site. I'm sure you have some sort of vision of what that large multiple-unit building under one roof would be. Do you?
Could be.
Could be. Do you want to project that vision? Should I ask that question after I've asked whether you think that the selection of an architect, for example, or architects
no,
for
Robert, that's a very touchy question. You want to know? You want to know if I would contribute an idea of what I'm talking about on paper, and I would. Because my real aim is not only to get better architects for America, but to leave behind me some better architecture. And I believe I might suggest something that would amount just to that. And I would never be paid for it in this world. I would have to give it.
Six months later, in his 90th year, after 70 years in architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright is dead. Here at Taliesin, built just below the crest of a hill, his work continues. Here, the Taliesin Fellowship, architects and apprentices, dedicate themselves to the completion of his projects and the perpetuation of his principles. Mrs. Frank Lloyd Wright.
Well, here we are once again, together, and I feel that we have been together just the same way for 30 years without interruption. And I thought, here is the line of continuity that everyone dreams of. Nothing seems to continue except by some principle. So it made me feel happy when I drove over the hill and looking at the same green hills as I did with Mr. Wright, coming here for some 30 years to hear him speak at first, and I continuing it now. Above all, he decided that he must make men capable of carrying on the line of continuity of a great principle, organic architecture. Now he left men behind, and he left me behind with absolute assurance that his work will not die.
Said the architect Eero Saarinen, if this were an age like the Renaissance, Frank Lloyd Wright would have been honored as the Michelangelo of the 20th century. His legacy, hundreds of buildings from almost a century of work, testaments to the freedom, the spirit, the individual dignity of man. Architecture is man's sense of himself, said Frank Lloyd Wright. As integrity is a quality within man, so it is in a building. To build a man or a building from within is always difficult to do.
So organic architecture, you see, takes this thought from within, the nature of the thing. It's a profound nature study. Well, that'll be more and more realized as it goes along and proves itself. As beautiful building after beautiful building gets itself constructed and built, they begin to look into it and try to find out what the secret was that kept that perennially young and always working and never let it die because it couldn't die. See, the product of a principle never dies. The fellows that practice it do, but the principle doesn't. The principle never dies.